Hi, Tadeo, and everyone else listening. Welcome to another episode of Simple Living High Thinking, where we unpack Tukaram Prabhu's Bhagavad Gita class from every Friday night, where you can tune in live. It's streamed live every Friday around 8 p.m., so West Coast time. We are concluding chapter 10 today. So, what sort of context would you like to give?
Howdy, Bo Kim. So, chapter 9 ends by essentially Krishna telling Arjuna to be his devotee. So, that's the end of chapter 9. We look at that instruction from Krishna to be his most powerful and special, the most secret instruction from Krishna to Arjuna and therefore all of us. So that's how chapter 9 ends. Krishna is essentially telling Arjuna, be my devotee, my special kind of devotee, my loving devotee, but be my devotee. And then now, in beginning of chapter 10, Krishna does a few things, which later he's going to talk about himself doing. Is quite interesting and wanting to go over that with you too, Kim. But the beginning of chapter 10, uh, Krishna speaks farther to Arjuna, right? He says, okay, for your benefit, I'm going to talk to you farther, talk to you more. And he says that it's very difficult to comprehend him, that even demigods truly don't understand him. And he describes all kinds of different opulences, I guess we can say, such as intelligence, knowledge, and so on, fear and fearlessness, and all these qualities being from him. So all these qualities come from him, from Krishna himself. And Krishna essentially says, I am the beginning, the middle, and the end of everything, that everything emanates from him. And that anyone who truly accepts this will then surrender to Krishna. Anyone that accepts Krishna being the beginning of everything, that everything emanates from him, will surrender to him, to Krishna, in love. And then Krishna speaks what we know in Bhagavad Gita as the Chatu Sloki. I think it's important to mention that because these are what our tradition considered to be the summary of the entire Bhagavad Gita. So these are four texts that Krishna speaks together. The first two is Krishna saying uh, about Krishna talking about himself, who he is, his position. And the last two is then Krishna talking about what he does for us. So how we perceive him in his actual position and what we do as devotees, and then what Krishna does for us. I think it's worthwhile reading those texts. And so the first one is text 8. Krishna say, I am the source of all spiritual and material worlds. Everything emanates from me. The wise who perfectly know this engage in my devotional service and worship me with all their hearts. So that's Krishna's position, right? I am the source of all spiritual and material worlds, and everything emanates from him. So that's a bit of his position. And then Krishna says, the thoughts of my devotees dwell in me, their lives are fully devoted to my service, and they derive great satisfaction and bliss from always enlightening one another and conversing about me. So now that's part of what we do as devotees. We are constantly thinking about Krishna, our thoughts dwell in Krishna. Then text 10 is part of what Krishna does in this doing, like what we do and Krishna is doing. This is the loving relationship. There's two parts. There's the part where we are doing something, and then there's the part where Krishna is doing something, and therefore establishing a loving relationship between the lover and the beloved. So then now the second two verses is Krishna acting in this relationship with us. Krishna says, to those who are constantly devoted to serving me with love, I give the understanding by which they can come to me. And then on text 11, to show them special mercy, them being us, I, dwelling in their hearts, destroy with the shining lamp of knowledge the darkness born of ignorance. So, in that 8, 9, 10, and 11 combination of verses is what is known as the Chatu Sloki. So, this is the summary of the entire Bhagavad Gita. So, let me take a step back. The first verse, Krishna says, because you are my dear friend, for your benefit, I shall speak to you further, giving you knowledge that is better than what I have already explained. So I mentioned that Krishna will say something and then he will do that something. So what Krishna is saying here is that, hey, I will give you knowledge that is even better than what I have already explained. But then at the last verse of the Chatu Sloki verses, Krishna says, to those who are constantly devoted to serving me with love, I give the understanding by which they can come to me. I, dwelling in their hearts, destroy with the shining lamp of knowledge the darkness born of ignorance. So now Krishna is actually doing that to Arjuna right now. So that's what I'm saying. Krishna is saying he's going to do something, but then he's actually doing it also. He's starting the chapter by giving Arjuna knowledge by which Arjuna can go to him. And he is destroying Arjuna's ignorance as he's sitting in Arjuna's heart by giving him this knowledge. And he's saying he will, he said, I'm going to tell you more. So he's not only he's saying he's going to do, but he's actually doing this, actually what's going on in this very chapter, in these very verses themselves. And we went over in class as well how it is appropriate to understand that at this point, at the end of Krishna speaking the Chatu Sloki verses, that he pauses, that he kind of ends the monologue that he has been conducting so far. And Arjuna is like, oh, don't stop. Like, tell me more. Tell me more about you, about your opulences and how I can see you in the world and so on. And that's also what Krishna said would have happened, right? In the Chatu Sloki's verses, Krishna says that his devotees, they take tremendous pleasure in hearing about Krishna and talking about Krishna. And then now is Arjuna's turn to actually illustrate how that takes place. And he does that by reacting to Krishna when Krishna stops. He goes, no, tell me more. I want to hear more about you, which is exactly what Krishna said devotees like Arjuna, pure devotees, would behave, that they would derive great satisfaction from hearing about Krishna. And then Arjuna says, yeah. And then Krishna Arjuna is exhibiting those symptoms, saying, hey, tell me more because it's so intriguing to me. So I want to hear more from you. And then coherent with what Krishna said he would do, he continues. He talks to Arjuna further, which is Krishna himself in Arjuna's heart, enlightening him and destroying his ignorance. And Krishna then continues by showing Arjuna all the ways in which he could see Krishna in the world, which essentially boiled down to identifying all of what is beautiful and intelligence and magnanimous and truth and beauty, essentially, that exists in the world, and linking that to Krishna, because Krishna is identifying all of these beautiful aspects of the natural world and saying, I am the best aspect of these individual categories, and those things come from me. So for example, Krishna would say of the sun, I am the light. I am the light of the sun. And so when we look at the sun, what's overwhelmingly powerful to us is how bright it is. And it's so obvious that the sun is there because it illuminates the entire planet. So it's difficult to miss it. And so Krishna says, when you see that, when you see the sun and how magnanimous it is and how powerful it is, because we can barely even look at it without the feeling of getting blind. It's so intimidating. Like, think about it. We can't even look at it. And Krishna is saying, I am that light of the sun. It's me that you are seeing. That magnanimous power of the sun is nothing but me. And so in that way, in so many other different aspects of power, beauty, truth, Krishna describes himself as being that thing in the material world, allowing us to perceive Krishna like that throughout the entire planet. Um, Arjuna, it's prior to actually Krishna explaining how we can see him in the material world, Arjuna does tell Krishna that he had accepted Krishna as the supreme Lord that he had said he was. And so Arjuna also does accept that, right? So I just wanted to mention that in terms of a summary of the entire chapter, that right before Krishna starts speaking about how we can see him in the world, he had paused for a moment, and then Krishna and Arjuna say, "Hey, tell me more." Part of Arjuna asking Krishna to tell him more is Arjuna telling Krishna, "I accept everything you told me so far," which is the beginning of the chapter, right? Krishna is saying that I am, that everything emanates from me. So Arjuna says, "I accept that, and please tell me more." Krishna goes on to say, to illustrate how we can see him in the entire world. And essentially the chapter ends there. So then we can see how Krishna is present not only here in the world but also transcendent, right? So I think that's a little bit of a summary of the chapter, and there's so much that comes up in this chapter. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts, Kim, on the chapter itself.
Yeah, I thank you for such a thorough summary, especially how Krishna starts it out. Like, I'm going to now expand on, that big verse that we talked about at the end of chapter 9 of how to become close to Krishna. And then he's given us more details. He doesn't just end the speech there like, okay, this is how you do it. But by going into so much detail, what I liked about this chapter was just how every little thing in this world, big, small, powerful, good, bad, it all is tied to Krishna, and he's everywhere. And I like the really specific examples in those verses from text, whatever it is, 21 or so to the end of the chapter, just example after example of how we can see Krishna in this world and that we're not alone. So,
Yeah, it's the interesting, not starting on text 20, which is how Krishna is showing his beauty and how we can appreciate that in the world. But prior to that, actually, um, let's see, that would be text 4 and 5. Krishna is telling Arjuna that he's everything, that everything comes from him. And to go into a little bit more of details of what he means by that, he speaks text 4 and 5, where he says intelligence, knowledge, freedom from doubt and delusion, forgiveness, truthfulness, control of the senses, control of the mind, happiness and distress. It's interesting here. Birth, but then also death and fear. It's interesting here. And fearlessness, non-violence, equanimity, satisfaction, austerity, charity, fame, infamy is interesting here. And all these various qualities of all living beings are created by me alone. So when I read 4 and 5 together, I get a sense that 95% of it is good and I want, but then there's a 5% there that I in the surface it's difficult to know what to do with them. And those are the distress and death and fear and infamy. So these four things, like what to do about them. Krishna is directly here saying these things come from me. And to Arjuna's response is, yes, I accept that. I accept everything you have said, and please tell me more. So Arjuna is accepting that distress and fear and death and infamy comes from Krishna, even though the remaining 95% of everything else is great. But how about these other things? I thought we would discuss that in context of the chapter, how Krishna is owning the entire existence as being something that emanates from him. this is a big theological difference between East and West. In Western traditions, because the understanding that suffering is due to our own misdeeds by misusing our free will, is almost as if we need something other than God to blame for suffering and death and distress and infamy. And that becomes a dualistic system where the devil exists and the devil is responsible for that. But our theology is different. We understand that God is all good, and sufferings that we experience in the world is due to our misuse of our own free will, essentially choosing to turn away from Krishna. And therefore, now we can continue to postulate within our theology the existence of an all-good God, because the bad things that we are experiencing is due to our own fault, our own misusage of our own free will. But what to do with this here now? That death, fear, and infamy is coming from Krishna, distress, right? So then how do we separate that? Well, that's how we can truly appreciate the depth of our theology. We're not shining away by creating a dualistic system where, oh, we're going to blame this other not so good things on the devil and the devil exists. No, everything comes from Krishna. Even our distress, we are actors in that distress. We also contribute to that distress by misuse of our free will. However, the energy we have that we use to misuse our free will comes from Krishna. The distress that we must undergo in order to become inquisitive and to realize we should embrace a different lifestyle, something that will make me better, and because I no longer want to suffer and seems like I'm going in the wrong way in life. That realization comes through suffering, through that distress. And so we can see that Krishna has a hands on that as well. His hand is to give us enough distress that will cause us to realize something is wrong. I must have taken a different turn, a wrong turn in the course of my journey, in the course of my life, because where I am right now is not really where I'm supposed to be. There's too much suffering here. And that's like a warning sign. Hey, make a U-turn, turn around. And that comes to us in the form of distress itself. And we are owning that. We're saying that distress is also coming from Krishna, but is ultimately to our benefits, but it's coming from Krishna. And that allows us to have a theology which is not dualistic, which the devil doesn't need to exist so that we can blame these other things on him. It is also coming from Krishna, but ultimately to our benefits. And so now we can truly appreciate the depth of our theology here, because it's full and complete. When Krishna does make a point here, I'm the source of everything and everything emanates from me. It almost sounds redundant. And that's how powerful of a message Krishna is sending. Everything, even the distress. And so now we have this very complete theology that is quite different from Western theology. And so I thought, to appreciate Krishna's beauty, it's beautiful. But then to realize that Krishna is also this not so perceivably beautiful things, but that is also come from him and is ultimately to our benefit. It gives such a sense that Krishna is the complete whole, and it is a complete theology and philosophy that leaves no room for any logical fallacy. So I truly appreciate that about what Krishna is doing here in this chapter.
Yeah, that's I like that you took us back to text 4 and 5 to hit home that point. It's like you said, it's such a big, huge distinction from the religion that I grew up with in Christianity. This idea of how duality and the devil creates such an easy, like dismissive notion towards the conception of divinity. And I think it's so bold that a tradition like this and many others dismiss that idea of the devil, and how we say, no, everything actually comes from Krishna. And what is our part in it? It's not like we're just this innocent bystander and, okay, Krishna brought me this suffering. Now we have to contend with that. Well, what was your role in this quote unquote suffering, whether it's this life or another life? And we've talked, many other previous episodes about karma and how that plays out, but it's just such a well thought out philosophy. It covers every question that someone might ask, and really tough questions. So I
Really
agree.
tough
This is, yeah. How do you get out of this one?
question.
So yeah, I like that you brought that out.
Along the lines of tough questions, I want to bring up another one, which has bothered me uh, for for a long time in the beginning when I had a hard time figuring it out, working it out, and then after hearing from our teachers, things were clear as they usually are when you listen to pure devotees. But I thought it's worthwhile mentioning here because I think a lot of people that tend to be a bit more philosophical would struggle in the beginning of their spiritual journey in contending with prominent atheistic philosophy, contemporary atheistic philosophy of today. And I will elaborate on one of the verses that Krishna speaks in this text to substantiate what I'm describing here. So back to hard questions in atheistic philosophies. So very prominent scientists of contemporary times will argue that our entire universe exists by chance, and that is due to random selections. Uh, it is not quite clear whether Darwin himself was trying to prove this or not. He provides quite little evidence, as it turns out, to be a complete scientific explanation of where species come from, but it does create a scenario in which God is not necessary. You don't have to have God in order for a species to exist. Darwin, in his book, in his work, Origins of Species, elaborates on a system by which a species could exist and even uh, vary from one another, although to a slight degree in his theory, but they vary to create others, but you don't have to have God who created it. And there isn't nothing that Darwin is postulating that implies that it was that these selections and the way in which species come about and adapt to their environments, that it was done by intelligence or by design, but rather it leaves room open to interpretation that it could have been by chance as well. And so atheists, scientists of today, they have a very seductive, I would say, arguments for how the entire creation happens by accidents and random. And it is a bit intimidating because this is scientists. These are scientists that are prominent and have done their homework, and they are elaborating on very esoteric principles of science that we, laymen, in terms of our scientific understanding of many different sciences, can get intimidated, it's like, and then doubt my own beliefs. Well, wait a minute, does Krishna exist or not? Because there's this real scientific theory here by these prominent scientists, almost ridiculing the idea of God. So what do we do with that? That's another tough question. And so I wanted to share how in this chapter I have been inspired in the past to contend with this own possible doubts or this own tough question. What to do with God? If prominent scientists of today argues that everything's done by chance, random sequence of events and a God doesn't have to exist. Well, the branch of science that intrigues me a lot is mathematics. For one reason is that it's such hardcore science. Mathematics seems to be true at all times, unlike other sciences that, according to the scientist understanding of that particular science at one particular point, it acts in this way, but then 10 years or 20 years later, once our technology advances, other scientists will say, actually, it works in a slightly different way than this other guy said in the past. And in that way, science seems to constantly change, and there isn't like a real grasp of what is an absolute truth. However, mathematics doesn't seem to suffer from this time issue. Everything that mathematics says was true a long time ago, still true now, and it doesn't seem to be changing in the future either. It doesn't seem that there's any room for any change in the future. So it's a very hardcore science. And then it's also another aspect of mathematics I like. There is this sensing which is not so tangible, it's not so material. So it's not necessarily transcendental, but it's not material. For example, if we say I clapped my hand once, okay, but then if I say I clapped my hand twice, so I clapped my hands 2 times because 1 + 1 is 2. Well, what is 2? Exactly. It's not something in the material realm. You cannot see 2. You can see 2 of a thing, so you can see 2 phones, but the idea of 2, the principle of 2, that is always true, that 1 + 1 is equal this so-called 2. What is that 2? It's essentially an idea. It's like it doesn't smell like anything. You cannot weight the idea of 2. So it has this almost metaphysical aspect to it as well. So that's another reason why I like mathematics so much. And the reason why I'm talking about mathematics here is because going back to, the problem of atheist scientists is that they will argue that we have amino acids, 20 of them, from which we can build protein. The building blocks of proteins are amino acids. And so you have 1 in 20 choice to give one amino acid, and let's say, put it in your experiment. And then now you have another 1 in 20 choices to get another amino acid and put to the other protein that you're creating until you create like a full protein, which then will become a cell, which then will become an organ, which then will become a species. The extraordinary, unfathomable, you can choose whatever word that expresses the highest power in your vocabulary, you would be applicable here. The extraordinary amount of information, precise, logical, and intelligent information that is needed in order for these selections of amino acids to then form a particular protein, to then form a particular cell, and then an organ, and then a species, is extraordinary. And so when you apply mathematics to this type of biology, and you consider our DNA, which is where all the information is stored, to then pick all these amino acids, which then form proteins, which then will form essentially species, it is a mind-boggling number when we count the amounts of information that is contained within a DNA. Mathematicians will say that, think about this, right? Mathematicians will say that if we were to stretch the amounts of information that is contained within the DNA in a string of a number, similar to how a computer science program is ultimately made out of zeros and ones, binary code. So if you were to get that 0 and 1 string of numbers and stretch it out, to match all the information that is contained within a DNA, that string of number would go up to the moon and back down to our planet over 5 million times, right? So that is not something that is comprehensible to anyone's mind. I don't like when people say, oh, God is so great, you can't understand God. I never really liked that. But when you start thinking about mathematics in this way, that is something that we cannot comprehend also. No matter how much we try to understand how much information that is in a DNA to then form species, it is incomprehensible. There is no way that any human mind or any computers for that matter can comprehend this type of information. And it all has to be done precisely according to that extraordinary amounts of information. If any tiny little, like if one of those amino acids was to be misplaced or neglected, a whole species would not exist or would exist in a whole different way. What to speak of everything else, the human body, the planets, the way the planets are orbiting the sun and so on. So the extraordinary amounts of intelligence that is needed for even for a human being to exist that is contained within a DNA is something that mathematicians have tried to calculate. It is so prohibitive, the idea that all of this was done by chance, because there's amounts of information that is contained in a DNA, from a mathematical perspective, the amounts of information and therefore intelligence that is contained in there. If that was to have happened by chance, it would have taken a mathematical amounts of time that nobody, it is so comprehensively prohibitive that renders it illogical, that is not logical to accept that even us, just our own body, was created by chance. And it is almost as if, and this point is so bewildering, that's why I'm trying to like make a bigger point out of this, because it's so bewildering to me that something that is so obvious has been used in its exact opposite way. Here's what I mean by that. It is so obvious that you cannot go to a casino in Las Vegas and win a $100 million jackpot every day of the year for 1,000 years. The likelihood, the odds, the mathematical odds that would happen is so prohibitive that would be illogical for you to accept, for any reasonable person to accept that it did happen and it happened by chance. Let's say that you could live for 100,000 years. So you would go every single day of the 100,000 years, you would have gone to a casino in Las Vegas, rolled it, whatever, like a blackjack or whatever gambling game gives you a lot of money, right? You would have rolled, I don't know, you bet on red 8 and then you rolled the roulette or whatever it may be. And that you would hit a jackpot of $100 million every single day, day in and day out, for 365 days of the year, for 100,000 years, that would have happened. The question would be, is it possible that that can happen? Yes, one could say it could be possible, but is it logical to accept that that would be the case? That is not logical. So this is a very minute example to illustrate the amounts of information that is contained in our DNA, precisely how would it have had to happen in order for us to exist as a species, and that happened by chance, simply by chance, similar to you walking into the casino and rolling a dice, and by random chance you won 100,000 years every day of the year. Similarly, it would be, well, somebody some random event just packed all up in this one DNA, all this information that is needed for this species to exist, and it happened by chance. That is even more unlikely, a lot more unlikely, mathematically speaking. If we get like real hardcore mathematicians that are trying to calculate this, it is a lot more unlikely that that would happen than that you would win the jackpot in a casino in Vegas every single day of every year for 100,000 years. And so it is not by chance. And what I said that is so bewildering to me, that we take something that is so obvious to be its exact opposite. Again, it is so obvious that there is intelligence that created us as a species and all the other species, all the other DNAs of all the other species. It is so obvious that it comes from an intelligent source, and that it was not done by chance, that it was done by a precise, intelligent design. And that it's been used in its other way. Like people, this atheist scientists saying, oh no, it was actually done by chance. They're actually arguing that prohibitive impossibility, that you would have gone to the casino and won $100 million jackpot every single day for 100,000 years. That's what they're saying. That everything happened by chance in that very unlikely likelihood. And so it's when I start thinking about mathematics and the implications of it in terms of Krishna's information, the mathematical information that is contained within a DNA, and the magnanimous creation that comes from that. And I see this one verse here, and how logical it would be that this was done by an infinitely intelligent source. To me, that is, when you can arrive at the conclusion and see that, it would be like a logician realizing truth, the conclusive truth. The conclusive is that there must be a infinitely intelligent being who created all of this, because it is impossible that all of this would have happened by chance. And so when I think about that, and when I like to think about Krishna in this way, the verse that I'm reminded of is 10:32, where Krishna says, of all creations, I am the beginning and the end, and also the middle. So, DNA is the beginning of a species. And Krishna says, of all sciences, I am the spiritual science of the self. And among logicians, I'm the conclusive truth. That conclusive truth speaks to me in this mathematical way. It is not possible that everything that we know happened by chance. There is an extraordinary amount of information, intelligent information contained within a DNA to create one species, something that is so mind-boggling that even very hardcore mathematicians can't calculate. And a tiny little example to illustrate what that would be, the odds that this would have done by chance, that the entire existence would exist by chance, is this less than sufficient analogy, but pointing towards something that we would walk into a casino in Las Vegas and hit $100 million jackpot every single day of the year for 100,000 years. That is just a small analogy from a mathematical perspective, the chances that the whole creation would have been done by chance, and therefore there is a logician, an extremely, infinitely intelligent person who created it all, because it is not possible, because the other alternative is not possible, that it was done by chance.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with many arguments from an atheistic point of view. So I really appreciate you hitting home this idea, because it illustrates it really clearly about why it is so improbable, this position, and not a very strong position, perhaps. Because I'm also curious, and maybe you can answer this, of what their response is to, if everything was created by chance, wouldn't there be a lot more anomalies in the world, a lot more mistakes? Like, okay, on the assembly line, like, okay, one came out perfectly. if it's by chance. But then about the other ones on the production line, well, this one is all off and this one's distorted and this one's that. And it seems like there'd be a lot more chaos in the world. Do they have a response to that?
Absolutely. They don't have a response for that. And what you're saying problematizes what I've been trying to illustrate here exponentially. Because now there's like not only us as the human species came about randomly by chance with these extraordinary amounts of necessary logical information all that was done by chance, but that all the other, according to Vedic scriptures, 8,400,000 other species. There's so many others, and that they all came out perfectly as well. It just makes this likelihood that it would have been so by chance so much more illogical and unreasonable to accept.
Yeah. Yeah, in the world, we're both from the world of IT and computer engineering, and in my job as an engineer, it's talked a lot about what are repeatable processes, especially when you get to an enterprise level for a big corporation like a Microsoft or a Starbucks. You need standards, you need repeatable processes, so it always comes out the same. And so when you think about, okay, this little seed is going to turn into a watermelon 100 out of 100 times. Okay, maybe the times that it doesn't get enough water or it's not in the proper soil, but it always turns into a watermelon, or this type of seed turns into a tree. And what accounts for that? And it seems like the world is run on such a dependable, stable computer system that is so elaborate that my mind would never understand. But there's so much structure in the world. So
that's why I like mathematics so much, because it never changes. It's such a constant, and whatever variables you throw at it, it will always output the same result, and it never changes in time. It doesn't change in time. It's not relative, it's absolute. And you can do so much far out stuff with it. And when you look at the DNA sequencing, it is nothing but a mathematical structure, an incomprehensibly intelligent mathematical structure that, like, as per what you're saying, Kim, it outputs the precise results every time. And there's such an order there that we can comprehend. Like, I never really liked this idea that, oh, you can't understand God. And I'm like, really? Well, like, what if I try really hard for like the next 30 years of my life and I really dedicate myself? Can I understand God then? I don't like to accept that, no, even then I couldn't, right? But when I look at mathematics, it is that way. No matter how much you try to understand, how much logical, precisely organized information is contained in a DNA of a human, we will never understand. The differences in our DNA between monkey, orangutan, I guess, between the orangutan and us humans. Orangutan, I believe, is the closest one to us. It is so minute. It is so minor. There is practically no differences in our DNAs. It's such a tiny variation. And yet, one precise, mathematically, intelligently arranged DNA sequencing gives rise to a orangutan. And another one that is so close, but yes, ever so slightly different, gives rise to us, human beings. And yet, we can speak, and the orangutans cannot. How much, like that in itself, just such a small difference in DNA to yell such a obvious and intellectual difference as human speech is so mind-boggling. Because think about our ability to speak. It's so intricate that even the most exoteric artificial intelligence programs that exist today that can beat the best chess player there is, still they cannot really capture and properly translate language, because language is such an intricate phenomenon that it actually requires consciousness in order to be able to articulate human consciousness. And so that tiny difference in DNA yields such a enormous difference in the existence between humans and orangutans, because we can speak and they cannot. And yeah, it's such a tiny variation in the DNA. It's like when Krishna ends this chapter by saying, but what need is that, Arjuna, for all this information? If we just have fragments of myself, I create and pervade the entire universe. Like this tiny things that creates amazing big things, such as this, like tiny small difference in the DNA that creates a big difference as far as speech is concerned, and all that contained in DNA. For us to accept that all of that was done by chance, it is absolutely ridiculous. It's almost laughable. Like I don't see how Richard Dawkins and this prominent atheist scientists of today, Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins, they walk on stage and there are hundreds of thousands of people who applaud them and worship them almost as this very rational and logical scientists that disregarded the possibility of God. And if you believe in God, you're then the apologetic. It's like, really? You guys truly believe that all of this happened by chance? Because that's what they're saying, you know? And so to then see Krishna saying, you know what, you want to see me in the world? Just look at the DNA and look at how the amount of information that is contained in there. Be amazed by that. No mathematician can calculate it. It's an extraordinary amount of information that we cannot even comprehend ever. We'll never be able to comprehend that. And conclude the truth that there is intelligence in an intelligent being who must have created it. Not the nonsense that they're postulating that it was done by chance. Another such analogy that people usually bring up to describe this chance is that, and also put in perspective of a timeline. How long would it take a monkey with a typewriter to compose the symphonies that Mozart and Beethoven were able to do it? Like, because a monkey with a typewriter, he's going to be randomly typing in the keyboard, and it would be random. Exactly how these atheist scientists are saying that the entire universe existed, including the arrangement of your DNA, happened by chance, and it was random. So a monkey typing in the typewriter is random. And how long would it take for that randomness that monkey is creating to at one point be an entire symphony that the likes of which only Mozart and Beethoven could have composed? How long would it take for that to happen? It is very unlikely that that would happen. That would not happen. Like, what is the point? Like, when do we go from saying it is very unlikely to actually saying it is impossible? Because to me, they're both the same. It is so prohibitive. It is so unlikely that that would happen that you might as well call it impossible and illogical. How long would it take for a monkey to compose Mozart? It will not happen. But then to get something that is even more complex than that, astronomically more complex than that, which is the sequencing of a human DNA, and say that that happened by chance and accept that, that is illogical, that is laughable, that is absolutely childish. And yet it is what a lot of people believe today due to these misleading atheistic philosophers. But the conclusive truth, as Krishna speaks here on 1032, which is a way that we can see him in the world, is that look at the DNA and just surrender to the amounts of logic and precise mathematical arrangement that exists there.
Yeah, and that kind of segues into another aspect of this chapter that I really enjoyed. And Tukaram Prabhu did such a beautiful job of speaking to this throughout all of our classes on chapter 10. And that is how we can apply this to our lives. So now we start to come into this acceptance and understanding of how everything is tied to Krishna, good and bad. We start to look at suffering and what that means for us, the implications, but then how can we use it to our advantage? How can we improve our lives? And this idea of having a better understanding of how Krishna is so accessible, from the religion that I grew up with, God was not very easily accessible. Intimate relationship with God was very foreign. That concept didn't even exist really. And so now we're taught that Krishna is everywhere, and we have these opportunities to see him everywhere. And then we take this knowledge, go back into the world, look at it through a different lens, and then start to shift like, oh, I see Krishna's grace or mercy in this event. Oh, I see I was struggling so long to try to understand religion. I was somehow seeking it. And then through Krishna's grace, he, helped open my eyes. I suddenly had this knowledge, like in chapter 10, to those who are constantly seeking me, I give them the understanding that they can come to me, and just this constant kind of dance of grace that Krishna just, obviously he can't violate or force us to see him or understand him or love him, but he can help us when we make this effort. And that really spoke to me throughout this chapter of just, he sees our struggles and sees our intentions. And when we seek to know him, even with our ignorance, even with our inability to understand everything about him, he'll give us what we need for where we are in life to come closer to him. So it's such a comforting and beautiful relationship that's going on, even though we don't even realize our relationship with Krishna. So yeah, I love this chapter.
Absolutely. And just to tag along what you're saying, because it's so beautiful, is this text 35 where Krishna says, of month, I am November, December. And of seasons, I am the flower bearing spring. Like, Krishna is identifying himself with spring. I mean, I like summer because it's hot and we can go to the beach and hang out. But spring, there's just a different quality when the flowers are coming, and their beauty, their colors, their smell just permeates everything. And Krishna is saying, I am that. Like you're saying, he's making himself so accessible. And it is so like you can just look at a flower now and recognize that as being nothing but a pointer to Krishna's beauty, because that beauty came from him. So yeah, I really enjoy what you're saying. Like we can really now navigate our lives here, being aware of Krishna everywhere. And in that sense, it's very, very accessible to us. And to speak of the completeness of our theology, I like how Krishna ends the chapter, because now here we are in chapter 10, where Krishna spends so many texts, so many verses talking about his eminence and how he's right here in the world in a way that we can see him, like we just spoke about, him even being the beauty in the flowers. And that can lead into a pantheistic view, a pantheistic theology. Well, that's what God is then, right? God is all these things put together. And that's like a pantheistic theology. But we have a panentheistic view of God. And that's how Krishna ends the chapter, or at least to my appreciation of it. Maybe Krishna intended something else, but to my level right now, what I can see is that, yes, still Krishna is talking about all his eminence and how he's right here in our world in a pantheistic form. But then he ends 41 and 42 by saying, know that all opulence, beautiful and glorious creations spring but for a spark of my splendor. But what need is there, Arjuna, for all this detailed knowledge? With a single fragment of myself, I pervade and support the entire universe. So that now Krishna is not just here, eminently available for us, but all of this is nothing but a spark of his splendor. And the fullness of his splendor is also elsewhere. Everything that we are seeing here in this natural world is just a tiny little spark of his splendor. And that would be like a pantheistic way of seeing things. If we were to say that the tiny little spark of his splendor is all that is God, that would be an error. That would be a pantheistic error, because that would be just a tiny spark. But in his full glory, he also exists elsewhere. And that's the transcendent aspect of him. thus giving rise to our theology, which is panentheistic. And so then Krishna, I like the way he ends because he's here, but he's also elsewhere.
Yeah, thanks for pointing that out again about the differences between pantheistic and panentheistic. So, because like you said, it is an important distinction. So to know that God is also beyond this world is, and we can reach out to that other world and to him beyond this world is nice. All right. Well, thank you, Tadeo, for such a nice episode and walking us through this chapter. I really enjoyed it. Yeah. And thank you, everyone who listened. And we will, I assume, be starting chapter 11 next week. So hope you join us again and join online for Tukaram Prabhu's Friday night class every week. It's really beautiful. All right. Thank you, Tadeo. And
thank you.
Hari Bol. Have a good
Hari
week.
Bol.
Hare